I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, he's called himself Tariff Man. Donald Trump has threatened levies on imports from friends and foes, among other measures. So, how will his economic policies affect Americans and the rest of the world? California's wildfires are on track to be the costliest disaster in U.S. history, but the state's insurance companies are in crisis. So who'll pay to repair the damage? And Britain plans its first sanctions law targeting people smugglers. But how will the measures work, and will they help stop the illegal trade? Tariffs are at the core of Donald Trump's economic policies, and he's threatened to hike them as soon as he assumes office as U.S. president. It's not just U.S. trade rivals who could be affected by the measures. Its allies are at risk too. Trump says the measures are aimed at protecting American industries, but he's gone as far as threatening to use economic force against Ottawa after suggesting that Canada should become the 51st U.S. state. Many economists have warned that his policies, which also include aggressively cutting taxes for some, could reignite inflation and spark a global trade war. But will they? We'll discuss all that with our guest shortly. But first, Victoria Gatenby reports.
Imposing hefty tariffs on imported goods is a threat Donald Trump repeated throughout his campaign.
To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff.
More recently, he refused to rule out using military force or economic coercion to seize the Panama Canal, take control of Greenland from Denmark, and force Canada into becoming a U.S. state.
We need them for economic security.
Trump says tariffs would encourage foreign companies to make goods in the U.S. Many business leaders say the cost of them would be borne by U.S. consumers in the form of higher prices.
Tariffs are taxes. We all know that. They are inflationary. They're paid for by consumers. And if we go forward with the proposals that President Trump has indicated he may put in place, it would have a severe reaction in terms of the prosperity of the United States, and it would increase inflation.
The Biden administration sharply increased tariffs on imports from China last year in an attempt to protect American jobs. They covered electric vehicles, batteries and semiconductors and applied to $18 billion worth of Chinese products. But Trump's plans go much further, and there are worries they could lead to trade wars.
If we consider him 10 to 20% on exports from all sources, except for 60% on China, we're seeing a tariff coverage that's 10 times the magnitude of the first trade war. And the tariff rates are much higher.
Economists say Wall Street has given Trump a honeymoon, with stocks initially surging. But some worry about the economic impact of his decision to hire tech gurus Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk to make massive government cuts. If Trump imposes tariffs that provoke retaliatory measures by China and others, economists warn they could hit U.S. exports and investors and drive up prices for ordinary Americans. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
So, what are tariffs and how do they work? Well, they're a tax on foreign goods brought into nations like the United States. Governments use them to protect their domestic industries. For example, a car imported into the US with a value of $50,000, subject to a 25% tariff, would face a $12,500 charge. Now, Trump insists that tariffs are paid for by foreign countries and won't cost the consumer. But experts almost universally disagree. The charge is physically paid by the domestic company that imports the goods and not the foreign company that exports it. Tariffs can hurt foreign countries if buyers shy away from higher prices caused by an increase in levies, but that can be mitigated if they sell their products elsewhere. Nations can also take retaliatory measures, which could lead to a full-blown trade war. Stephen Okun is the CEO of APAC Advisors and former Deputy General Counsel at the US Department of Transportation. He joins us now from Singapore. Stephen, good to have you with us. So, as we heard, Trump's favourite word in the dictionary is tariffs. What can we expect of him? Will he follow through on his threats, bearing in mind that you and I are talking a couple of days before the inauguration?
Yes, he will follow through. He believes in tariffs. He used tariffs last time. President Biden continue those tariffs, which the the Trump administration incoming believes, validates that everything they did was correct. So we're going to get tariffs, and we're going to get even more tariffs than we have right now.
So are those tariffs, though, going to help or hinder the US economy? Are they going to be inflationary?
They will probably be inflationary to some degree. Two things to keep in mind. First, the Trump administration will believe they can offset some of that inflationary impact from the tariffs by, taking action such as deregulatory impacts that they'll look at doing in terms of the United States. So they will do some things that can offset it. But more importantly, they believe that the United States has to have these tariffs because, one, it ensures a level playing field, especially with China. Two, it protects the U.S. national security. And if the cost of protecting U.S. national security is a little bit of inflation with tariffs, well, then that's a price worth paying.
How do you see, then, the relationship with China developing over the course of the Trump administration?
Well, I mean, I think with the starting point for the Trump administration, and frankly for the Biden administration, and even towards the tail end of the Obama administration, is that China has taken action after action after action against the United States that has been unfair. It's been unfair in terms of forced technology transfers. When U.S. and other companies come into China, they're expected to give up their technology. It's unfair competition because of all the state subsidies that China has been doing. It's unfair competition with regards to the Made in China 2025 policy that's been in place for a decade now. That has worked for China. China is now dominating a lot of the key sectors of the 21st century, such as electric vehicles. And so this is in reaction to what China has done. So it's not so much what is Trump going to do to level that playing field, to retaliate against China, is will China be willing to engage with the United States, or is China going to further retaliate that will increase the trade war that we have ongoing now?
All right, so that's China dealt with. What about the rest of us? Do we need to worry about Trump's tariffs? How is all of this going to play out and affect all of us and the rest of the world?
Yeah, well, first, if you look at what's going to happen to the rest of the world with regards to China, this is not the U.S. against China. Other countries need to protect their sectors against China. You have tariffs coming on China from the EU, from Brazil, from countries in Southeast Asia because of the same unfair trade practices that China is using when it comes to electric vehicles. You also have concerns throughout the world, including the United States, but everywhere else, about China's excess capacity that they're dumping into markets that's hollowing out some of the industrial bases that you see in the U.S. and you see elsewhere. So part of this is going to be, is the world, in the EU, Southeast Asia, in parts, Japan, Korea, what are they going to do vis-a-vis China? And then how is China going to react? Because if you see this, China plus one, this diversification of supply chain out of China because of the tariffs the U.S. has been putting on. It's not just the U.S. and the Japanese and the Europeans that are diversifying out of China. It's the Chinese who are diversifying out of China. And what is that going to do? There's upsides and downsides for countries for where China's diversifying. So it really is not just that what's going to happen between the U.S. and China. It's all the effects from that. In addition to, and I think to your point, Adrian, the U.S. is also going to put tariffs on other countries, Canada, Mexico, the EU. We're going to see that as well. And so, yeah, we're in for a lot of tension in trade going forward throughout the world as a result of Donald Trump's presidency and his approach to an America First agenda. I'm
glad you brought up Canada there. What are we to make of that nonsense? And also his threats to take Greenland by force and take back the Panama Canal.
Well, okay, so one's tariffs and one's more of a national security strategy that he seems to have going. With regards to Canada and Mexico in particular, this is where Donald Trump says it's better not to work in the existing rules-based system, the WTO or trilateral or plurilateral trade agreements, but it's better for us to engage one-on-one bilaterally with countries, because anytime the U.S. negotiates with someone, the U.S. is in a superior position because it has a larger economy, it has a stronger military, it has a bigger market. It's just got advantages for any one-on-one negotiation. And what Trump does is he weaponizes the economy, he weaponizes tariffs. And so he says to Canada, or he says to Mexico, I don't like what's happening at the border. I don't like what's happening at immigration. It's that piece is more of a bargaining chip, and we will see if countries are able to come to some bargain like Canada and Mexico. One would think so. One could say it's to the U.S.'s short-term benefit, but it probably harms the U.S. in the long term.
And finally, what about the markets? To what extent will they act as a guardrail against some of Trump's more extreme desires, if you like?
I mean, look, that is one of the only guardrails that seems to be left on Donald Trump's actions. What we're seeing so far in the hearings in the Republican-controlled Congress, in the House, in the Senate, they're going to do seemingly almost anything that Donald Trump says. So you're not going to have a check from the Congress. The courts don't seem to be standing up to him. They give deference much more to the executive branch and the president than they have done in the past. So the courts aren't necessarily going to be a check. The check is going to be the markets. And that is going to be the argument that people are going to have to make, governments, businesses, investors, when Donald Trump and his administration take those actions that are inflationary, both with regards to tariffs, with regards to deportation that's going to lead to wage inflation in the United States if he carries out what he's claiming to do. The markets are our guardrail, and we're going to have to see if the guardrail holds, or if Donald Trump is going to say it differently this time. More important to focus on our national interest, regardless of the market's going to take a hit.
Really good to talk to you, Stephen. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you.
Large swathes of land were burned, thousands of structures destroyed, and entire neighborhoods that were once home to multi-million-dollar properties reduced to ash and rubble. The cost of the damage caused by the wildfires in Los Angeles is estimated to run into tens of billions of dollars, and they could become the costliest wildfires in U.S. history in terms of insured losses. Now, that spells trouble for insurance companies, which are already in crisis. Families and businesses are trying to pick up the pieces as recovery operations continue. Michael Appel reports.
A scene of devastation. Whole neighborhoods reduced to ash and rubble. Thousands of people lost everything: their homes, their property, memories, and in most tragic cases, their loved ones. The fortunate were insured and will be compensated, but many were not.
In the past few months and stuff, some of the homeowners have had their insurances canceled just because the insurance company didn't want to cover them anymore. So there are some people who will be without insurance.
California's insurance crisis has been brewing since wildfires in 2018, which resulted in big losses for insurance companies. They've since become wary of issuing policies to those living in high-risk areas. The FAIR program, backed by the California government, was introduced to offer protection to property owners who could no longer find it in the private market. But it's expensive and provides less coverage than commercial plans.
We're going to make sure that the FAIR plan and those in it get the help that's guaranteed under that program. We'll do whatever's necessary. We're going to also have to address the broader insurance crisis that has forced people into the FAIR plan.
For some, the cost of insurance was simply too high. It's estimated that 10.5% of homeowners in California, more than 800,000 people, have no coverage at all. The federal government will help to rebuild roads and infrastructure, but whether it will step in to help individual home and small business owners remains to be seen.
Although the federal government is going to cover 100% of the cost for the next 180 days for things like firefighter overtime pay, debris removal, temporary shelters, it's going to cost tens of billions of dollars to get Los Angeles back to where it was. So we're going to need Congress to step up to provide funding.
Worsening and more frequent fires blamed on climate change have made it harder for insurance companies to predict their potential losses from weather-related events or to recover them. A number of companies have left California entirely. And if this trend continues, many more homeowners will be unable to afford coverage, increasing the risk of an insurance crisis in the state. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Jason Kirkpatrick is a climate expert and head of communications at Razom. We stand. He joins us now from Berlin. Good to have you with us, Jason. Is it possible at this early stage to put an accurate figure on the total damage and the cost to the economy and the sectors that have been most affected?
Yeah, costs we're hearing so far about the LA fires because of this extreme weather disruption we're seeing getting worse and worse. The first costs we're seeing are $40 billion possibly to the industry, says Wells Fargo. We've seen figures of up to $275 billion for the entire economic losses. The governor of California says probably the worst ever natural catastrophe. And this affects all sorts of sectors that you might not even think of. For example, Hollywood and the film industry there, they generate revenues of up to $45 billion a year. And a lot of the filming, for those of us from Los Angeles, we know a lot of the filming happens around there, up in the hills. We heard about Malibu burning, Beverly Hills. So there's some concern about the film industry slowly starting to move out of LA. So the impacts are horrendous and they need to be addressed. And the good thing is that in terms of extreme weather that gets worse and worse and makes these fires and all sorts of floods worse and worse, we can address that in a cost-effective way that actually profits.
It's a staggering cost. Who's going to pick up the bill?
Right. Well, insurance companies are backing out, and that's even turning into this public-private partnership, which we see also with flood insurance. This is not just impacting California around fires or Florida around hurricanes, but Europe, England or Germany have insurance companies complaining about floods and flooding and losing billions. So the federal government, but it's in a way, it's the same kind of public-private partnership that we see with the nuclear industry and these extreme catastrophes. So when times are good, when everything works well, there's profit there for the insurance companies or the nuclear industry. When times go bad, there's fires, floods, or with the nuclear industry, if there's a meltdown or dealing with thousands of years of nuclear waste, it's the public that pays. So this is something that needs to be addressed, and the public need to really take a hard look at this and see if the politicians they're electing to make these kind of decisions, they want to keep electing them and have these losses paid with the public purse.
Do you think that these fires are a wake-up call at last, and that people now are beginning to realise that they need to implement these kind of measures, even if politicians don't realise that?
Yes, slowly. And luckily for us that are concerned about climate disruption, clean energy, and lives are lost too. In the USA, in richer countries, we're a bit more able to adapt, although I think it's 25 lives lost in Los Angeles, which is a tragedy. But when these extreme weather events happen, for example, in Africa, they create droughts where it's reported hundreds of thousands or millions are starving to death because of this climate disruption. So people are taking people are getting awake, and especially one thing that's doing is the economics. We see these solar panels getting cheaper and cheaper. Electric cars now, in the last couple of years, are at the point where over the lifespan, they're cheaper. We're seeing China, especially China, is leading the way in producing now really super cheap solar panels, electric cars. And in China, they're switching faster than anyone expected. And this is having ramifications on the global oil market. So Trump says, drill, baby, drill. He's going to be pivoting to oil and gas. But the oil industry themselves says that they do not predict in coming years rapid gasoline or oil need, because they're looking at China, where there's a massive rollout of electric cars. And the oil company themselves in America, they're predicting that there is no need for massively increasing oil supply in coming years. And they don't see an environment where it makes sense to invest. So Trump himself is going to have to be facing the reality of the clean energy revolution that's just coming.
And what about the insurance companies and individual homeowners and small business owners who've lost everything? We heard in Michael's report that there are thousands of people who had no insurance at all because it had simply become too expensive, or they couldn't get cover because insurance companies were not willing to take the risk. What needs to change so that people whose lives are there, they live there, can continue to live there and know that they're covered against future climate-related events?
Sadly, I would say, and I'm sure I hear insurance executives saying the same thing. The insurance industry in America, in many ways, is broken. Luckily, in California, they have a kind of backup plan, which is in a way like Obamacare for people that aren't able to afford insurance or have market value rates, so that the poorest of the poor can get some insurance. As we know, Los Angeles already has a homeless problem. This fire makes more people homeless, and it's not just those that have lost $2 million houses in Malibu who have to search a place. Maybe they can afford a hotel or go stay with a friend. But also the people that are often migrants, they might be cleaning pools of these richer folks or doing the gardening. Now, those folks are also out of a job, and those folks are maybe 1 week's paycheck away from real homelessness.
Jason, been really fascinating to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us on Counting the Cost.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Nearly 37,000 people crossed the English Channel on small boats in 2024. Migrants, mainly from North Africa, the Middle East and elsewhere in Europe, pay thousands of dollars to traffickers to try to cross one of the world's busiest shipping routes. Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer is under pressure to crack down on the flow of migrants attempting to make the dangerous and illegal journey to the UK via France's northern coast. Starmer says that if you're going to smash a gang that's driven by money, you need to follow the money. And he plans to do that by introducing a new sanctions regime on smuggling networks. Now, under the plans announced last week, the government could freeze the assets of those suspected of people smuggling and implement travel bans against them. The proposed measures would mean UK-based individuals and financial institutions would be barred by law from dealing with those sanctioned. Critics say, though, the measures are not enough to stop the small boat crossings. Starmer has abolished the controversial Rwanda scheme established by the previous Conservative government, which planned to deport migrants arriving in the UK illegally to Rwanda. Peter Walsh is a senior researcher at the Migration Observatory and the University of Oxford, lecturer in migration studies. He joins us now from Oxford. Good to have you with us, Peter. So how big of a problem is the issue of people smuggling in the UK, and what impact do migrants have on the British economy?
It is a big problem. It certainly attracts an outsized proportion of attention, mostly negative attention. You mentioned that last year some 36,000 people arrived in small boats without authorization across the English Channel. Now, almost all of those, if not all of them, so far as we are aware, had their journeys facilitated by smugglers. These days, it's just not possible to make that journey without the assistance of these people smuggling networks. Now, with regard to effects on the economy, if we're thinking about unauthorized migrants, and by the way, most of these migrants, once they arrive in the UK, they claim asylum, and according to UK law, they're not permitted to work until they've been in the country for at least 12 months. So that's waiting for at least 12 months for a decision on their asylum claim, and waiting for that period through no fault of their own. And that's quite a large share of people, but that's a fairly restrictive policy. Other countries like Sweden, Australia, Canada allow asylum seekers to work straight away. Germany, it's after 3 months. So that's quite a tough policy. And we have seen in recent months, and indeed years, pressure on the government from refugee charities, most recently from the head of the Migration Advisory Committee, that's the independent body that advises the government on its migration policy, to actually release this ban. And the argument is that when these people arrive, if they're destitute, the government is obligated to provide them with accommodation and asylum support payments. And the government is providing that support to 110,000 people at the moment, and that's rung up a big bill, over £4 billion last fiscal year, just on accommodation and asylum support payments. And the argument runs, if you allow these individuals to work, they'll make a contribution to the exchequer through the income tax that they pay, and they'll no longer be as reliant on government accommodation and support.
So how will the Prime Minister's proposals to implement sanctions against people smugglers work, given that people smugglers operate generally in a cash-based, informal network? How can the government target their assets?
It's a great question, and the government hasn't provided enough clarity on this. It did gesture in its press release on this policy on sanctions of the importance of cooperation with other countries. That, of course, is absolutely critical. But I think the bigger question is, how are you going to regulate these kinds of payments, which are often by cash, they're often anonymous, using the Hawala system? And for the time being, we do not have a clear answer to that question. Now, in theory, remember, this is part of an approach summarized by the three-word phrase, smash the gangs. Now, in theory, if you invest more resources in disrupting the activities of the smuggling gangs, then more will be brought to justice. But that doesn't necessarily mean you will get less unauthorized migration across the channel. And that's because, okay, you can apprehend some of the people who are involved most directly on the ground in the smuggling operations, but they can very quickly be replaced. It doesn't require a lot of investment to train the skills required or a big financial investment to get a small boat smuggling operation up and running. So you can apprehend these individuals, but can you apprehend them at a faster rate than they can be replaced? Now, that is a fundamental challenge. It was faced by the previous government. The Labour government are probably learning about that now. The other one, of course, is those are the lower level individuals, but what about the masterminds, the senior figures in the smuggling networks? The challenge there is that they often operate in countries far beyond not only the UK's jurisdiction, but beyond that of Europe, in countries like Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Iran. So for these sanctions regimes to have a real tangible impact on disrupting smuggling activity, you need close cooperation with those countries. Raises another big question about how this is actually going to work in practice.
Peter, it's been great to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you very much indeed.
And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, you can get me at A Finnegan on X. Try to remember to use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or you could drop us a line. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. There's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, even entire editions for you to catch up on. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.